and thank you all for being here. This panel discussion is about revealing the Islamic Republic's game plan. This panel is organized by Be Iran Voice and Act for Iran. It's non-partisan groups that works for the sake of human rights in Iran. This panel consists of two different topics with a break in the middle. The first topic is about international sanctions on IRGC and the European Union's approach to such sanctions. The second topic is about the Islamic Republic's lobbyists and the effect it has on democratic countries. We have invited experts that will inform you on the topics, and after each topic, there will be time for a Q&A where you and the audience can ask questions to the panelists.
Well, it's great to be with you, and good afternoon to everyone. It's morning in Washington, D.C. right now. And I think we're in a very important time right now in Europe because the landscape has really shifted, in my assessment, in the European Union's posture towards the Islamic Republic. We are seeing since September a series of sanctions tranches that have been levied by the EU and the UK. And if we contrast that to the period even before September 16, there were only 2 sanctions tranches that the EU had levied on Iran since 2013. And now here we are in January, and I think we're at least 4. So that is important. That is an uptick, and I do think that there is a lot of momentum for change. Now, that being said, I think it's critical that the EU sanction the IRGC as a terrorist organization because for substantive reasons and also for symbolic reasons. First of all, the IRGC meets the legal criteria in my view, for a designation as a terrorist organization. There doesn't need to necessarily be a court case in the European Union proper. There could be one undertaken by a third country like the United States, and there are a multitude of those cases on the books. Last year is the most recent one with an IRGC murder for hire attempt against a former U.S. National Security Advisor. And if we're looking for one of the more recent examples in the European Union, there have been active investigations about IRGC attempted fire bombings of German synagogues and also an attempted murder of Bernard-Henri Lévy in Paris. So, and this was all undertaken by the IRGC's Quds Force, according to public reporting. So in my view, the legal criteria has been met because it doesn't necessarily have to be a final court verdict. It could also be a prosecution or an investigation or a commencement of an investigation. And it could be either in the European Union or in a third country, as I said, like the United States. So I think we're there with the legal requirement. I think the excuses that you're hearing with some of the European Union officials saying that there needs to be a court decision is really trying to punt what for some may be an uncomfortable policy decision because of the engagement approach that the European Union has taken with respect to the Islamic Republic. But I think that the game has really changed over the last few months with Iran's arming of Russia against an EU candidate country, Ukraine, its abuse of its citizens, active terror plots in countries like the UK, and a whole host of other reasons. So for that, I do think that it is well past time for the European Union to do what its ally, the United States, has done and sanction the IRGC as a terrorist organization.
Let's not forget that the IRGC have been designated by the US. In 2007, they were designated as a terrorist organization, parts of the IRGC. Later in 2017, the whole of IRGC was designated as a terrorist organization. And in 2019, the IRGC was added to the US State Department's FTO list. That's a foreign terrorist organization. And there is unfortunately a fact that sanctions may, to some part, be limitless and useless against the IRGC. And that's also why it is so important to not solely focus on the IRGC, but also focus on the Islamic Republic in its entity, in its entirety. Because at the end of the day, it is the elite of the Islamic Republic of Iran, it is the Islamic regime's establishment who are responsible for everything that's going on in Iran. And at the top of that, it's Ali Khamenei. So sanctions, with that said, sanctions may be limitless. However, they do have effects, and we have seen that after that they were designated by the Americans in 2007, 17, and 19. However, we know that Iran does have friends in, for example, Russia, in China, in North Korea, countries which no one else wants to be friends with, but which Iran are friends with, of course. And they will come to assist. So therefore, it is highly important that we not only focus on the IRGC.
It is useful, and I think targeting individuals and entities are both important here. And let's understand that and I'm reminded by a line that I read just recently in Le Monde by an unnamed Iranian businessman who mentioned that the IRGC designation would impact retired IRGC officers who keep the economy running, who travel to Europe often with their families. And so the sanctions on individual IRGC members could be effective, and Europe should definitely consider those steps. I do think that the designation has, in my view, substantive impact with respect to constraining the amount of resources that the guardsmen have to spend on their whole panoply of repressive activities. And at the same time, it's also an important symbolic, there's an important symbolic element here with the designation. And it's a signal from the leading democracies of the world that they hear the calls on the chants of the Iranian revolutionaries in the streets, calling down with the IRGC, death to the IRGC, and it's a signal that the leading democracies of the world stand with them and not their oppressors. And so I think that we can't underestimate the symbolic aspect here, because in many respects the symbolism is substantive for a lot of people around the world with the IRGC. And it's not, and also the Iranian people, as many of your audience knows, are the greatest victims of the IRGC, but there are a whole host of other victims of the IRGC in the region, from Israelis and the Arab states. So I think that this is definitely an important, there's a really important symbolic element here as well that we should not discount.
Over the last 43 years, one of the main reasons for why the Islamic Republic have stayed in power, and for why many individuals have not acted upon the Islamic regime, even though they have opposed it, is because there have been a fear that if we overthrow the Islamic regime, Iran's national integrity, Iran's borders may be at risk. If there were any substance to that, the recent movements we have seen in Iran, the last month's protests, have clearly shown that that's not the case. Let's see the different regions of Iran which consist of different minorities, like, for example, the Iranian Kurdistan, like Iranian Balochistan, Gilan, and so on. We have seen that they are shouting that we will sacrifice our lives for Iran, that we are one. Iran is our country. So weakening the IRGC will absolutely not have any impact on Iran's national integrity. To the contrary, weakening the IRGC means that the IRGC can no longer use the same kind of violence against its own people, or just like Mr. Brodsky here told us, the Quds force of the IRGC are highly active around both the region, but also in Europe, in the US, and so on and so forth. However, their malign activities in the region have caused some of the countries in the region, unfortunately, to support separatism in Iran. But with the death of IRGC, that issue will be resolved. So this is nothing more than a rumor from the Islamic regime to still keep in power.
Yes, I completely agree, and I would just add, I like to view the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as the guardian of the Islamic Revolution, not the Iranian people. And that, understanding that difference here, I think is critical. And I also think it would go a long way in understanding that I think European Union and Canada, UK, the United States, G7 countries do have a role here to play. I think that it is important for them to kind of signal rhetorically and also in action that they are committed to maintaining and preserving the Iranian territorial integrity, and that would be an important signal for them to send as well to the Iranian people to alleviate those fears. I've heard European officials, justify pumping the brakes on the IRGC terrorist designation by saying, well, wait, they're already sanctioned in their entirety. Yes, that's true. Technically, the IRGC is under what's called weapons of mass destruction related sanctions. But the issue here is that under the nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, those weapons of mass destruction related sanctions are scheduled to be lifted this year in October 2023. And so the EU is saying we want to revive the JCPOA, and at the same time is saying, well, these IRGC sanctions are already on the books, and there's no need to implement the terrorism designation here. And so that talking point, just in my view, it doesn't work. Also, I don't think that we should be using the argument that it's superfluous. It would have no effect on the guardsmen. I think it will have an effect, and I think we're seeing the very loud, vociferous warnings that the Iranian system is telegraphing to the European Union ahead of a potential terrorism designation, and it shows how bothered the system is by this particular step. And I do think it would have substantive impact, as I mentioned before. It goes beyond the asset freezes. There is the Iranian system for a long time has viewed Europe as a way to whitewash and legitimize its rule, and that getting European acceptance of their system is a very important part for the Iranian establishment. So I think that plays into this calculation here, and we should not fall into the trap of thinking that, oh, the sanctions are duplicative and would have no effect. I think that it would have an impact. We can't underestimate the psychological impact in this respect. And lastly, and I will just conclude with this, the United States has the IRGC sanctioned under multiple tags: nuclear-related sanctions, human rights-related designations, terrorism-related designations, missile and drone proliferation designations. So I think that it would be an important step for the European Union to do so, because it would harmonize the transatlantic sanctions architecture against the IRGC, and that's very important.
If designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization and continue empowering sanctions on it, if that would be not effective, if that would be useless, we would not see the heads of the IRGC the last couple of weeks threatening every single individual on the earth. You have, for example, Hossein Salami, the commander-in-chief of the IRGC, stating that if Europe would do anything like this, if Europe would sanction, we will harm Europe very harshly. Just for a couple of days ago, you had Admiral Tang Siri, the commander of the IRGC Navy, stating almost the same thing. This is quite usual in Iran, that you every time something happens that you start threatening people. In Farsi we call it hartopurt kardan. This is quite usual to do, but it's been quite more intensified the last weeks, and that's because they are quite afraid of what implications designating IRGC as a terrorist organization would have. And except for the symbolic value of it, except for the psychological value of it, we will definitely see financial impacts on the IRGC. And also, let's not forget that designating IRGC as a terrorist organization means that nobody can attend its meetings, nobody can hold up its logos and so on. And let's not forget that only last year in Stockholm, here in Stockholm, we had the individuals rallying, holding up the IRGC's logos. They have people all over. We need to find them as well. Designating the IRGC is one way towards that.
Well, I think that the JCPOA from 2015 is dead. The geopolitical, political, and technical reality that the deal from 2015 was based on no longer exists. Geopolitically, we have Iran arming Russia with lethal drones and potentially soon surface-to-surface missiles against an EU candidate country, Ukraine, where it's targeting civilians and critical infrastructure. Those are war crimes. So the geopolitical landscape has shifted. Iran right now is employing what it has for years used with its proxies against Israel and Arab countries, and now in the backyard of Europe. So that is a very important shift, and I think that more than anything else has really contributed to the hardening of the European Union towards the Islamic Republic. Politically, we have a situation where the Iranian people are telegraphing to the international community that the Islamic Republic is an illegitimate government, and it's been a very powerful cry from Iran. I think that's been heard worldwide, and that the political dynamic, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. So the ground has shifted since 2015 politically. And technically, look, the Iran nuclear program is so far advanced and so well past the restrictions that were placed in 2015, given their advances with advanced centrifuges and uranium metal production, 60% uranium enrichment. So it has rendered and hollowed out that JCPOA from 2015 into a hollow shell. In my view, that the JCPOA from 2015 is dead. Does that mean diplomacy is dead with the Islamic Republic on the nuclear file generally? I don't think that's necessarily the case in the minds of some policymakers. But just the JCPOA is not synonymous with diplomacy with the Islamic Republic, and I think that distinction sometimes gets lost in the conversation, and it's important to keep that in mind. In my view, right now, it would be a horrible decision to engage in diplomacy with the Islamic Republic while it's killing its people and committing war crimes in Europe.
Sweden is right now leading the EU, and when reading the objectives of the Swedish government in leading the EU, you can read that one of its objectives is to revive the 2015 JCPOA, and that gives us a huge responsibility here in Sweden, both us as civilians, but also our politicians in the Swedish Parliament. In order to put pressure on the Swedish government, especially maybe Tobias Billström, the foreign minister of this country, to forget about the JCPOA because of its many limitations and because of the fact that, just like Mr. Brodsky has said, JCPOA is already dead. And what the European Union is trying to do is to just keep the regime floating and keeping their head over the water.
Well, a few things. I've been concerned with the High Representative's posture towards Iran for a long time. I think it's been disrespectful for him not to attend the parliamentary debates on Iran. I think it was disrespectful not only to the European Parliament, I think it was disrespectful to the thousands of Iranians who came to Strasbourg exercising their rights, democratic rights, to advocate for their compatriots. So I think that was a very big mistake by him. I thought his remarks on Monday were deeply unfortunate. They were really dismissive. I think that no one is. He said that yes, technically that we need a court decision. Well, yeah, technically, as I mentioned before, there needs to be at least an investigation or a decision by a judicial authority or a competent authority to undertake a terrorism designation. But then he said something saying that we can't just designate someone as a terrorist because we don't like them. No one is arguing that we want to designate the IRGC because we don't like them. We're arguing that the IRGC should be designated as a terrorist or an entity because of 4 decades worth of evidence that can fill multiple libraries of its involvement in terrorism against the Iranian people and the international community. So I thought that those remarks were unfortunate and were dismissive. I also thought they were a little discordant. His entire posture was really not on the same page with the president of the European Commission, who came out publicly in favor of the IRGC's terrorism designation. Now, true, in the end, the Council of the European Union is the one who makes the call, but that lack of message discipline in the Commission itself was kind of curious to me, and as I mentioned before, I strongly disagreed with him not attending the debate and some of his commentary ahead of the Foreign Affairs Council meeting. My assessment would be this follows in a long line of comments he has made through the years. In 2019, he was congratulating Iran on the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. So there are a host of very curious comments that I don't have an answer to be frank. I think that he has a very strong attachment to the JCPOA, as do many in Brussels. But as we were mentioning before, the nostalgia is detached from the sunset schedule and the details surrounding the JCPOA, and it's dead.
Well, Mr. Borell's statement is just a lifeline he's throwing out for the Islamic regime at this time. The fact is that there is amount of evidence that the IRGC have conducted covert operations in different countries. Terrorism is one of them. Espionage is another. Let's not forget, for example, that the Amia bombing in Argentina for many years ago against a Jewish center where many people were killed. The investigation the Argentinians have had clearly shows the role of the IRGC, but also the role of the Ministry of Intelligence. So once again, I would very much like to say that let's not only focus on the IRGC, let's also focus on the entity of the Islamic Republic, and not least the Ministry of Intelligence. The Ministry of Intelligence is not to be forgotten. There we have a lot of court rulings. We have individuals, the head of the Islamic regime being hunted by the Interpol because of the role in different terrorist attacks. So just like Mr. Brodsky says, we have third countries stating this fact. So what Mr. Borell is saying is not true. If you look at the Islamic Republic's constitution, the IRGC is not a regular army of the country. That's the Artesh. There is no name of Iran in the IRGC. It's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The constitution is quite clear that their only role is to defend the Islamic revolution and to spread the Islamic revolution. It's quite easy to designate them as a terrorist organization because that is exactly what they are, and why the European Union are trying so hard to keep the Islamic Republic alive. I think we got the answer in the film clip which was sent in the beginning of this, that if the Islamic regime is destroyed and a democratic, secular government comes back to Iran, then this will not be an easy path for the Europeans, who for 43 years have been supporting the Islamic regime.
I think it would be a historic move for the European Union. It would be a turning point in its relationship with the Islamic Republic. It's been engaged in this engagement-heavy, pressure-light posture for a very long time, dating back decades with the Islamic Republic, and I think that it would definitely send a very strong, powerful message to the Islamic Republic that it will not be business as usual anymore. But I think it's important to understand that sanctions are necessary, but they're not sufficient. I would argue that you have to marry sanctions with steps to isolate the Islamic Republic diplomatically, meaning downgrading ties with the Islamic Republic in the European Union, withdrawing ambassadors from Tehran, declaring discrete Iranian diplomats persona non grata in the European Union. I think that would be a critical step to really tell, if you want to get the attention of Ayatollah Khamenei to say that it won't be business as usual, you have to take these kinds of steps. The cycle of summoning ambassadors, sanctions on piecemeal mid-level Iranian officials is really not changing the Iranian system's calculus. And if you really want to get the attention of the decision makers in Tehran, these are the steps that you're going to need, I think the European Union is going to need to take. So I think it would be a very powerful signal, and I do sense that there is a lot of momentum in that direction.
The Islamic Republic should be the main objective of what we are doing, and the best way to do that and the best way to conduct that is to look forward to the Islamic regime's embassies in different European countries. My suggestion have always been that we need to close the embassies and we need to send their ambassadors back home. However, that cannot be done according to some international laws. So what European countries can do instead is to summon back their own ambassadors, because then the Islamic regime will do the same. And my next suggestion is that if you do not want to do that, if you do not want to close the embassies, then you can minimize the embassies to the minimum level of individuals that can work in there. There is no need for the Islamic regime to have tens of individuals working in its different embassies when we know that a huge rate of them are either agents of the Ministry of Intelligence or agents of the IRGC. So close the embassies. If you cannot do that, minimize the individuals that work there. This is something countries can do. Let only the ambassador and another individual working with consular affairs be there. There is no need for the regime to have so many individuals in its embassies.
It's a very challenging question that are tasked to do so, because the IRGC operates in many respects through smuggling rings and front companies, and it takes a lot of governmental attention and resources to do so. But we have not seen the degree of sanctions enforcement, at least in my country, that I would like to see. And we see this play out with respect to China purchasing illicit sales of Iranian energy, and the IRGC is a part of those transfers and arrangements. So that we're going to need to crack down on the sanctions enforcement side. And the European Union has a role here to play as well, because most of their economic sanctions have been suspended as a result of the JCPOA, and they have not reimposed those sanctions because they have been holding on to this hope that they could revive the JCPOA. But with it looking to be like it's unrevivable every day that passes, and Iran being in significant non-performance with the accord, I think it's well past time we invoke snapback sanctions and for the European Union to reimpose their economic sanctions that would absolutely cut into the IRGC's revenue stream here. So those are important steps to take. I think other members of the G7 also have a role here to play. Japan, not many people think of Japan here with respect to Iran, but it does have a very important relationship with Tehran. And Japan has not levied one sanction on Iran since September. It's the only member of the G7 that has not done so. And Japan is actually now the president of the G7 in 2023. So I think that the United States and other allies in Europe have a real role here to play in marshaling an international coalition to choke off the revenue which goes to the IRGC in large respects, and that's going to be a critical task ahead in my view.
Sanctions is of course one way to do so. The next one is that we need national laws and national regulations, making it much easier to not only follow the money, but also to prosecute individuals, but also making life difficult for these individuals. One example is Sweden, for example, where we know that Russia during many years have purchased several very important building offices and areas in Sweden. China is doing the very same thing, but there have never been any real focus on Iran, so Iran have been able to move on. So we need better national laws and regulations, and we need the different countries' security services and intelligence institutions to work much more closely to find these individuals. But to find them and to follow the money is not that difficult. Already, for example, in Sweden, we know very well who are doing what on behalf of the IRGC. We have names, we have their information, we know absolutely everything, but there are no laws or there are no regulations that we can use in order to prosecute them. And that's something which our politicians need to look at, because at the end of the day, it's they who are deciding which laws this country will have.
Sure. Well, I think that there is an upcoming meeting of the EU Foreign Affairs Council on February 20th, and that's going to be critical in between now and that date to keep up the momentum. I know that there are demonstrations being planned in a few European capitals to press for the need for this designation, and it has only really been because of the Iranian diaspora's mobilization and unbelievable, unprecedented unity and political activity that we have been able to make all of this progress. My organization has been pushing for the IRGC designation for years, but we have now seen this incredible momentum, and I think that leading up to that February 20th date is going to be very important. I just want to pick up one other comment, piggybacking off of what was just said, how we can target IRGC's revenue a little more. I have argued that I think that there needs to be an international task force developed that is made up of governments across the world, something modeled after what we're doing with Russia, targeting the assets of Russian oligarchs abroad, And I think we need to do that in the Iran context, particularly the IRGC. There's a Russian elites, proxies, and oligarchs task force. I think we need to create an Iranian elites, oligarchs, and proxies task force to go after this corruption, this illicit wealth that oftentimes we see IRGC satellites using Europe, Canada, and other jurisdictions as permissive environments to profit off of this kind of wealth. So I think that coordination is very much needed.
A task force would be great and ideal to have. However, I think that there is too much support for the regime in European countries. So I don't believe at all that something like that could happen, even though I very much wish that could be the very case. There lies a huge responsibility on us living in full freedom without any fear to be killed or executed tomorrow, even though we also live under threat. The regime is not, of course, silent. They continue threatening with violence and so on and so forth. However, there lies a great responsibility on us to put pressure on our politicians, to put pressure on those who decide laws and the regulations, to make them understand how dangerous this aspect is. And what I really want to emphasize on, it's very important to make them understand that this is not only about Iran. This is a matter of international security. The Islamic Republic of Iran has not been only a threat for the Iranian people and Iran itself, but it has been a threat for the international community for over 43 years. Let's not forget, in 1979, when Khomeini came back to Iran from exile, he was questioned by a Canadian journalist in the airplane. What do you feel now that you are coming back to Iran again from exile? And his translator, Sadiq Qutbzadeh, translated this for Khomeini, and Khomeini answered, "Nothing. I do not feel a thing." It was with feeling nothing for his home country he came to Iran. And very soon after that, they attacked the American embassy. So the regime clearly showed its face for 44 years ago, 43 years ago. Some of us have just not understood it before now. IRGC has actually been quite active in Europe in covert operations, both with respect to espionage but also with respect to assassinations. We know, for example, that they tried to kill William Nygaard, the person who translated the satanic verses of Salman Rushdie, but also its Italian translator. We have had many attacks in Europe where Iranian dissidents have been killed. And we know that much of them, it has been the Ministry of Intelligence. However, the Ministry of Intelligence have always used members of the Quds force to conduct these assassinations. However, with that said, you're fully correct. We need to be much more clear in that the IRGC is a threat in so many ways until the Europeans understand that. Otherwise, if they don't, then we get back to our friend there, which asked about whether Borell may be corrupt. I don't know if he is or not. However, we know that this is a modus operandi of the Islamic regime. It's we know, for example, let's not forget this Senator Nye of the US, which, interestingly enough, Trita Parsi worked for, and which later would show that Nye received money from the Islamic regime in order to help them to go around the sanctions. So this is a well-known modus operandi of the regime, and I would not be surprised if we in 10 years, 20 years or 30 years would have some kind of a EU leaks where such documents would be available.
What he said about MOIS employing Quds Force operatives, that is correct, and there has actually been a court case about this, and if you want, if we're talking about designating the IRGC as a terrorist entity, here you go. In Germany, with the Mykonos case, MOIS ran the operation, but they employed people on the ground in Germany who had IRGC pedigrees. So that, again, is evidence that the IRGC is engaged in terrorist activity. It's just indisputable. Again, the policy decision here is very uncomfortable for European policymakers, and I think it's up to us, all of us, to make them more comfortable with it. And that's going to entail advocacy, speaking with your elected officials, speaking with policymakers, demonstrations, the incredible social media campaigns that have been going on, documenting and illuminating and educating these officials as to the situation as it relates to the IRGC. We have seen France be risk averse with as it relates to terrorism designations. And I think we see this with Hezbollah. France has been resistant to designating Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. Right now, only the Hezbollah's military wing is a terrorist entity in the European Union, and that's because of France. Up until recently, France was also dragging its feet on supporting designating the IRGC as a terrorist entity, although according to some reports, they're more supportive of it now. Look, I do think that there are a multitude of examples in France with respect to the IRGC's terror. As I mentioned before, there was an assassination attempt against Bernard-Henri Lévy in Paris last year, and that was the Quds Force plot. They paid $150,000 to an Iranian drug dealer who hired additional co-conspirators in the plot that French police thankfully thwarted. And now, as we saw, Charlie Hebdo's staff is under threat. The commander-in-chief of the IRGC has threatened them. This is not just an attack on Charlie Hebdo, it's an attack on freedom of expression and the democratic values that Europe holds dear. And I think we see shades of what happened with Salman Rushdie here, and tragically, as we know, these plots, this incitement sometimes leads to lethal outcomes, and we saw that sadly last summer in New York with Salman Rushdie, who lost sight in one eye and use of a hand after he was stabbed there, and that person who did so was incited, at the least, by Iranian the fatwa that Khomeini issued in 1989 against Rushdie. So that all plays into the real, very serious threat landscape that we see the Charlie Hebdo staff under. They were just sanctioned recently by the Iranian system, and I know everyone likes to always kind of poke fun at these Iranian MFA sanctions that are put out against European officials, but there is a serious element to them because a lot of times, not just Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs is involved in the enforcement of these sanctions, but other Iranian security institutions are involved, like MOIS, the Quds Force, and elsewhere. So that's where it gets serious. France, I have not seen a reaction publicly in terms of actual tangible steps from France for these threats. There has been an aggressive law enforcement response, but the policy response has not really occurred, at least visibly to me, from my perspective. And so I would like to see more out of Paris on a lot of these cases.
We need to use other groups, and it's actually a large question mark for me why not only Swedish groups but worldwide working with environmental questions, which, for example, in Sweden it's such a huge issue, but nobody cares that the Islamic regime for 44 years have destroyed everything with environmental to do, the animals, the forests, and everything. And not only with respect to that, but also with respect to many other questions. And I think that one very important question is that Iran is a country very, very far away. It's not close to Europe. It's not, many individuals, I don't think they even know what the capital of Iran is. So that's perhaps why, and we did actually see that when Russia started the war with Ukraine, and many was questioning, okay, how come we are so open with these immigrants and not with other immigrants? And one of the main things shown in some scientific studies which was conducted was that, well, Ukraine is so much closer to Sweden, it affects us in a much larger way. But of course we do need other organizations. Feminist movements, I mean, where have they been for the last 43 years when Iranian women have gone from everything to absolutely nothing in that country? So we need them, and how can we get them involved? Well, it's very much up to you guys who are sitting here.
As I mentioned before, see the landscape in Europe starting to change. At least that's how I interpret it from the U.S. We're trying our hardest in the United States as well to solidify the sanctions architecture, and also to try to put pressure on the Biden administration to take more of a public leadership role in trying to rally Europe to making the changes it needs to do in its Iran policy. And I hope that we'll start to see results. I think we already are, but there's a lot more work left to do. But thanks, I enjoyed the conversation.